What's up, guys? Welcome for another Speaker's Corner round, I guess. Today is going to be an interesting one because this is a debate I had with Mohammed Hijab maybe ages ago. And, you know, I think I kind of came with a little bit more of a, holy moly, why is my computer acting up? I kind of came with a little bit more good faith in this conversation, trying to come to a middle in which most people who are fundamentally Islamist or, you know, of an Islamic upbringing don't believe that Islam can be reformed, don't believe Islam can be reinterpreted, and don't really feel that Islam needs to be. And you know, it's a difficult conversation here on the left, obviously, because the left is tolerant. It doesn't try to force its ideology onto people. It just tries to convince people via education and various kind of like persuasive outlets such as social media and you know, certain propagandas. Anyway, this particular video is probably one of the first signs in which I definitely saw a bit of a dishonest nature towards Speaker's Corner like idols. Mohammed Hijab is not necessarily a bad person by heart or nature, but I definitely feel that he is very sold on his ideology and doesn't really want to shake a little bit. So we had a conversation in which obviously I believe the idea of feminism, women's rights and women's treatment within the Islamic community came up, and I'm not the same as everyone else in the UK where I believe the isolated incidences of people being stoned and people being burnt and people being raped and all of that stuff as if it does not happen in isolation or just doesn't happen in the UK and in the West. I'm thoroughly aware that these crimes do happen quite frequently in communities that demonstrate the same kind of like socio-economic problems and, you know, adherence to patriarchal religions and so on. And I do understand that that does happen in the UK. We still have a predominantly patriarchal outlook when it comes to women's agency, women's rights and women's reproductive expression. And for the most part, like, I'm someone who is liberal in understanding that people have agency, and that includes children as well, to the point where I believe my child should be able to dictate what career choice suits them, regardless of my opinion. So let's get straight into this one. This is going to be an interesting one because, hey, I'm defending feminism. Crazy stuff. Alright, let's get it going.
Their physiologies, psychologies, all their biologies, right? Now, what I'm saying to you, and I'd love to ask anyone this, in fact, not just you, if we agree with the premise that identical things should be treated equally and that men and women are not identical, there should be a therefore there. It's a deduction. Therefore, men and women should not be treated absolutely equally. So, for example, right, and this is why I think there is a fallacy in the feministic argument, because when feminists on the one hand, they argue for equal outcomes, equal opportunities for me is not that controversial. I'm not talking about equal opportunities. I agree that there should be to a greater extent than not.
Should we not concentrate on that as opposed to something that we both have said that's not really a thing?
To a greater extent, but there are exceptions to the rule. Like, for example, the situation in America, where the firefighters in America had to go through a whole like you know, they do like a physical challenge. Yeah, they do it in like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. And the feminists campaigned against them. And because men are faster and stronger than women, as can be noticed by almost every sport that they partake in, with almost no controversy whatsoever.
This is a fallacy of men. This is one of the biggest kind of like things that we've sold as a society to men. The idea that men are naturally bigger, faster, stronger, and all of what have you. And the big problem with Mohammed Hijab's kind of like stance in this particular instance is that he tries to conflate those particular kind of superficial aspects and tries to lump them in with human rights. Now, human rights is just basically, I guess, the equality when it comes to opportunity. Like, it's never been the equality when it comes to result. Feminists complain when it comes to results. Feminists complain that there's still a disproportionate, you know, representation of privileges that are experienced by men and disadvantages that are experienced by women. And when people talk about feminists wanting equal outcome, it's normally mischaracterized so badly because, you know, they don't actually have an argument for the fact that we've lived in a majority patriarchal society for centuries, which meant that women were disadvantaged when it comes to nutrients, nurture, job opportunities, encouragement to explore certain fields, pioneering certain kind of sporting ventures, etc. All of these things that men take so much pride in, we've actually been encouraged and allowed to explore. Similar to the IQ, when you are allowed and you are encouraged to explore certain avenues that actually engage the I guess the elements that tinker with the IQ, you see a raise, also known as the Flynn effect. You see a difference and a raise in people's IQ, and obviously as well you see the shrinking of the gap between certain particular people who have been given those privileges and people who haven't been given those privileges. When it comes to women and the equal opportunity, and we bring certain things such as athletics, we bring certain things such as physicality, strength, and the firefighting, what have you, you know, you could not tell me that the strongest woman is weaker than the weakest man. You could not tell me that the strongest, most athletic woman is somehow less deserving of that job than your average male who tends to be either overweight or dependent on alcohol. The idea that feminists are pushing for these impossible standards that can never be reached because of the natural differences between men and women is so ahistorical. It's laughable. And we know this from the fact that majority of human civilization or human gatherings have been hunter-gatherer. Hunter-gatherer dictated that you had higher numbers in order to, I guess, guarantee a better hunt, guarantee more resources were brought back, guarantee more safety, because, you know, safety in numbers. This meant that women as well were included in this particular hunter-gatherer scheme when it came to going out to fetch X, Y, and Z, including the hunting. Women, for the most part, have been served a hard blow by nature, biology, whatever have you, because obviously they carry babies for 9 months. But to pretty much ridicule women's potential, opportunity, and capability by such a small section of their lives. 9 months, oh, that'd be horrible. 9 months in comparison to 80 years, which is the current life expectancy for women, is nothing. But that's what we've dictated women's suitability of work potential on, and it's utterly idiotic. And these particular discriminations and keeping women in certain gender constructs is what has led to not needing massive bones, not needing to be faster, not needing to be stronger. All of these things that have been societally constructed. So when you create that particular environment and they end up with the result that they have, that doesn't mean that they do not have the capability to reach the same level of physicality as men. It's utterly preposterous, and I'm pretty sure majority of biologists would agree with that notion.
No controversy whatsoever.
I'll give you an example. You say that...
No, let me just finish. Sorry, I haven't finished the sentence. I just want to say that because of...
Notice how this whole argument is how feminism causes death. I believe the original title was Mohammed Hijab defeats feminist or destroys feminism or whatever. And you'll notice in this particular clip, I don't actually get that much of a say. It's just an extracted clip from an entire conversation to which Mohammed Hijab concedes that his position has limitations.
Of the feminists rallying the firefighting professionals and saying that we don't want this, what's happened is that they've had to, the course that they would have to do, the physical course, that would have taken, let's say, 10 minutes, they've had to add, let's say, a minute to it. Why? So that they can be more inclusive of women. Now the question is, if there is a burning building, who would you want to save you? A woman that could come 30 seconds later, or a man that will come 30 seconds earlier will save your life? I believe you, the biggest feminist in the building would want a man to come, even if it means admission that in this situation we don't want equality of opportunity or outcome. If So this is just one specialized example. I'm not saying society is filled with those examples, but this is an exacerbated example of a situation where it's very clear that men have an advantage over women, and a non-recognition of this is tantamount to life and death. So this is where feminism can lead to death. Now, the point I'm making...
Now, this particular instance is obviously feminism leads to death, and obviously that's the name of the title. It's such a stupid point, and I have to be very frank and I have to be very blunt, because you have to call out sexism where sexism exists, and this is a horrible representation of how men belittle women's opportunities and belittle women's contributions to society. For anyone who's done a physical job, whether that be policing, whether that be a firefighter, whether that be plumbing, etc., most jobs nowadays cater to make sure that people can continue working. It's not a thing where you join a manual labor job and you break your back in order to lift certain X, Y, and Z, or take certain people out of fire because you're the strongest in X, Y, and Z. Most people actually go into fires looking to also preserve their own life. Most firefighters are heroes because they put themselves at risk and they put themselves on the line. But the idea that this weird romanticization that we have of people in these particular jobs, that even an example would be like policemen. People expect policemen to fire warning shots and to fire at the legs instead of the center, etc., and blah blah blah. Police brutality aside, these are romanticizations, and this is not how the working world works. We have certain policies, procedures to make sure that the least amount of effort is being applied to make sure that certain physical damages cannot be done to the human body that can later then sue the institutions that had those practices because they didn't assess whether or not it would be safe. So an example would be obviously like coal mining and all of those manual labor jobs where you were taking in solvents and chemicals that were naturally kind of degrading, eroding your body, one sniff at a time, and the long kind of like exposure to these particular elements would actually increase certain things such as cancer, cardiovascular disease, what have you. These particular jobs have now been refashioned to make it less effort, but also make sure that you're not exposed to the same selection. It's not even selection pressures, I shouldn't say that, but you're not exposed to the same kind of like hazards and risks that you were before. So this idea that a fire is basically men running into this building and it's like a dogfight, they try and grab as many people as possible, that's not how firefighting works. It's a classic misunderstanding of how any job works. They have policies, they have procedures of how to proceed into a building that is burning down, how to save people. Their main objective is to put out that fire. Their main objective is to secure people, keep them in particular environments, etc. Most firefighters won't go in trying to take people out. They will try to put the fire in, and most buildings are made in such a way that will keep a fire contained into a particular area. So Mohammed Hijab's understanding of firefighters is somewhat, it's non-existent.
Speaking to you is, we have to look, because you're a man of science and you talk about empiricism and rationalism and these things. If we look holistically and once again at what is the most effective and efficient thing for an economy, we have to take into consideration those factors. Once again, feminists, and this is the argument of Warren Farron.
Well, that's the thing, like, you're not taking into consideration the actual jobs and what is required of them. You've kind of made up this idea of what a job is or what is required and so on. And again, we're the same with society. You've made up this idea of what is required, etc. And you've decided that women are not necessarily fit for that purpose. I'd have to disagree from the fact that most societies and most economies were kept running quite with very little difference. Obviously the war efforts taking massive casualties and massive numbers away, and obviously bombing expeditions into cities such as London obviously would have like cracked down the economy quite a bit, but women kept this country running during the war. Part of the main reason women have the same rights as men today is because they demonstrated historically that they have the same capabilities of keeping a society alive as men. So again, ahistorical.
He says that they don't take into consideration the fact that men have been conscripted into the armies for maybe 10 for the whole of American history. There's been male conscription. There has never been female conscription. If we want to equalize the historical problem of patriarchal society, what we're going to need to do is conscribe women to an army for the same amount of times that we've conscribed men to the army. So
it's, again, it's a silly point, because the idea is that men's inability to effectively argue for their own rights should also become women's experience. If women can argue their rights better than men, they don't have to go through the same suffering. Like, that is down to men's inability to, I guess, transcend toxic masculinity and argue for each other as opposed to compete against each other. So this idea that women have to conscribe, which is an idea that I used to be understanding of, in the sense that suffrage for women was achieved with not as much bloodshed as men. We need to understand that we create the society that we're in patriarchally as men. We do that, right? We have the power. We have more power than women to change our current circumstances and our current conditions. We choose not to. Women don't have the ability to do that. In fact, they are belittled, discriminated, and sometimes ousted, sometimes murdered for speaking out for their own rights and equality. So it's, again, non-comparable.
But if we want equality, now we have to get women drafted, forced into being in an army, drafted and forced into being in an army the same amount of times that men had been in the past. But this argument, this is why it's a fallacious argument, and it's premised on a false premise. And the premise is, despite the despite the natural differences, we should have the equality on every level. And I'm saying to you that doesn't make any sense. If we accept the premise that identical things should be treated equally, and we identify that women are not identical to men, then there must be a space, at least in some instances, where women will be treated differently to men. That's why we have maternity leave. That's why we have so many things society has put in place for women. That's why in emergencies, women and children are taken out first before men, because it's assumed men are more physically.
Well, again, maternity leave is still patriarchal in nature, and it's still something that benefits the men and keeps the women out of the workplace, and discourages emancipation from male finance. Like, this is, again, such a massive misinterpretation of feminist theory and feminist kind of like talking points. When Mohammed Hijab obviously talks about the instances in which women have been granted X, Y, and Z to try and make and alleviate situations, it reminds me of when people talk about affirmative action for black people. And it's just like, when you are alleviating things that were ultimately discriminations beforehand, it's still not addressing the negative in which you already set these particular women. So an example being that if you have £10 and you give someone a backdraft, or you give them -5 to start off with, you say that you owe £5 to X, Y, and Z, and you give the other person £5 and you give that person £5. Now the person's debt is paid, but the other person also now has £5. Is that equality? Because you've given them both £5. That's an equal amount. But you also gave this person a debt to start off with. You alleviated those debts, the debt being obviously discrimination and stuff, with the £5 being the affirmative action and maternity leave and whatnot. Does that make them equal now to the person who has £5 even though they have nothing? It's a silly argument, absolutely silly argument. But one thing I want to touch upon is obviously his analysis of feminist theory, where it comes to, what was he saying just a moment ago? Let me just remind myself.
Self-sufficient, and rightfully, in my opinion.
Right, equality on all parameters. Now, again, this is so silly, because the idea is that women are asking for equality on every realm, so we need to do all this X, Y, and Z in order to, like, it's such a pedantic thinking. Like, start off with what they're actually asking for, and don't run with your own conclusions. Like, if someone gives you an argument, don't make stuff up in order to address their argument. Just address their argument. So when we're talking about equality on all levels, we're talking about equality of opportunity. So address certain discriminations that may affect women by allowing them certain schemes and partnerships, internships, whatever that, you know, yes, disproportionately advantages them, but you are trying to address historical disadvantages. So you're trying to get rid of that gap, or at least that negative that you've already prescribed to someone. That's not the same as trying your hardest to get everywhere, you know, the same, you know. And it's the same with IQ. This argument is very similar, and you can see the parallels between how white supremacists try to say that black people aren't necessarily fit for X, Y, and Z, or blah, 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 or can't do this or can't do that, because their IQ is not the same as white people. And again, like, this doesn't take into consideration certain elements such as historical achievements, doesn't take into certain elements athleticism, doesn't take into element the accomplishments of black people despite such a massive set of discriminations. So this political kind of like religious dogma that shows inherent sexism towards women is such a massive problem because of the one, mischaracterization of women's arguments, but two, the inherent entitlement that men feel to kind of be superior towards women. It's not something that I can opinion
assumed that men are more physically self-sufficient than women. That's why men have been drafted into the armies, and that's why women have been able to enjoy the privilege of being protected by male military men for almost all of civilization cross-culturally. So we can't...
I don't think women getting bombed during the Blitz is enjoying safety. And, you know, again, when we're talking about wars that happen in the minority of human spectrum, but we're talking about a lack of agency, a lack of equality, a lack of female respect, a lack of sexual autonomy. We're talking the fact that women were able to be sold, raped, abused, harassed, etc. These are psychological pressures that women just exist with on default, right? That means that where men have had wars and had to sacrifice themselves for women, bear in mind, women don't make up the upper echelons when we're talking historically. They don't make up the majority of people who decided to practice war. So when you say sacrifice, no, it's not really sacrifice, because women never consented to any of these wars in the first place. Majority of women anyway. When we're talking about sacrifice, we're talking about the fact that people who have made conscious decisions together, one person decides to take the heat or take the damage, etc., protecting and leaving the other person to maintain their integrity. But again, such a bad miscalculation.
We can't have our cake and eat it both. We can't say we want equality of outcome and opportunity, but at the same time have these exceptions which feminists put in place, you see, which of course entitle them to things which are otherwise not.
Then this is what I'm trying to say. Your argument is reductionist. And when I say reductionist,
it doesn't mean it's wrong.
I understand, but I say it in a sweet...
Reductionist absolutely means it's wrong. Reductionist means that you are not taking into consideration the multitude of factors in which influence the outcome of someone's success. By not doing that, you are inherently being discriminatory towards them. Discrimination is wrong, Mohammed Hijab. It is wrong.
Sense, right? Yeah. I understand you come from a standpoint where there's a lot of colonial imperialist science that has been enforced on the Middle East as if it's the highest standard. Mm-hmm. I'm coming to say that in particular that's not the case. We can work together, kind of thing.
Yeah,
I feel like there's a lot
I agree that we can work together.
There's a lot of conservative values that the Middle East and certain Arab countries have that the West has lost. Now that would be a nice middle to come into. Yeah. Discussing those differences, and we can meet in the middle of that. But the only problem I have to say is that when it comes to talking to Muslims in particular, that it becomes a very reductionist argument in the sense that, like you say, there's a difference between men and women. I'll ask you a simple question. Can you name me a white sprinter faster than any black male sprinter?
And that's why I say to you that I've always made the argument, I've made this on camera as well, that actually this is the fallacy of the West. Because if you look at the sprinters and, for example, black sprinters, they have consistently outperformed white sprinters for the last 100 years. Now, that's the question. Because they're not equal.
Reductionist. Like, to say that is just, like, bear in mind that despite long sprinters, fast sprinters, whatever, like, you know, there are white sprinters who are faster than black sprinters. Shock horror. There are long distance runners who are much faster than black long distance runners. Like, if you take someone who is short, stocky like myself, coming from a short twitch kind of like culture, and Congo Basin an example, not necessarily Kenya where the altitude is super high, you have a difference that would actually give a European person more of an advantage in being a long distance sprinter. So when we're talking about obviously like athleticism, even athleticism is a demonstration of how environments play such a massive contribution to how we develop as individuals and as a species. And the fact that that is even a thing means that it can be changed, and we can, again, we're talking like sci-fi here, but it's not even sci-fi, it's just the long kind of like time that would be needed in order to kind of like see the difference in results. It's probably a little while because of evolution. But if you take someone and start to train them, whether or not they're European or whatever, train them in that same high altitude as Kenyans do, breed generations there, you will find that they will start matching, maybe even beating the Kenyans. So the fact that we can take certain environmental factors, change them, and actually change a person's outcome is where you are being reductionist by saying that no, that is not the case, or you're not even aware that is the case, and you're saying that it is written in stone, this is how it is. That is a reductionist argument. You are wrong.
You think, well, hold on, black sprinters and white sprinters are not equal.
Well, you gotta be fair.
They're not.
No, I understand.
Black sprinters are faster.
We know why.
Genetically. Identical.
Alright, so that's that. So that's an interesting one. I think that should definitely serve as an example for what kind of speakers you do find at Speaker's Corner. And Mohammed Hijab is not a dummy. He's not someone who necessarily is on my level personally, but you know, he's someone who is respected and someone who is acknowledged at least as a powerhouse within Speaker's Corner. But you can now start to see, or at least understand, the reductionist thinking that tends to happen whenever people are just exposed to one particular stimulus and aren't necessarily exposed to other forms of thinking. And you know, you become very puritanical in that instance, and you know, that just never seen, it's not a progressive measure for survival. It's not a adaptation is probably one of the biggest reasons we are the species we are today. Without adaptation, without exposing ourselves to different selection pressures, we wouldn't be the species we are today, separate from our primate cousins and, you know, our ape cousins and so on. Mohammed Hijab, unfortunately, is of a very classic Islamic male nature, in which, you know, you could go into the conversation about how the Middle East still has a lot of I guess instability, and they're trying to find their way, and a lot of fundamentalist thinking is obviously needed to keep the kind of like resources and cash flow within a particular middle in order to, you know, strengthen an empire, strengthen a community, society, whatever have you. And you know, there's an argument to say that that is acceptable. But ultimately, when you kind of like take that and then you import that into a culture that is a little bit further along the lines in terms of their own development and so on, these arguments have no place. These arguments fall very flat on their face, and they don't have any merit, as you've just currently seen. And I guess it's interesting because back then I was trying my hardest to be a little bit more understanding about the elements in which the Middle East is, you know, still a developing region of the world, where, you know, various other regions of the world are still playing catch up to, you know, Western industrialism and so on. And you know, we're seeing very slowly the liberation of certain regions of the world that were very fundamentalist in their thinking about certain things when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to sexual reproduction, when it comes to movies, music, you know, what have you. So we're seeing a difference definitely as development becomes a thing, but also as well, I think what we're seeing now with like a lot of Muslim preachers, a lot of Muslim kind of like Dawa people, is a reaction to the fact that this is happening, a reaction to the fact that people are now starting to find themselves more atheist than they are showing their allegiance to religion. Absolutely. So I think it's very difficult and it's hard to have a conversation with a culture that is still kind of like finding its feet and so on, about left leanings, right leanings, reform, and all of those kinds of elements, without trying to sound patronizing, without trying to sound almost like a colonial missionary. So, you know, good. The debate was good. You should watch it in its entirety. Your boy represents as usual. And yeah, man, stick around. We'll do some more. Stay sexy. And sex work is work.